Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Helen Hsu. I use she, her, ta pronouns, and I'm the president of Division 45 and the director of outreach at Stanford University CAPS. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second of 5 webinars on the subject of fostering policy-relevant psychological research. Thanks to Drs. Abby Stewart and Sarah Mancole from Division 9, SPICY, Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, for leading this effort of colleagues from 6 APA divisions. We are grateful for APA Relations CODAPAR for funding this important series at a time when the impact of public policy on the well-being of communities nationwide and worldwide is more relevant than ever. Thank you to Division 8, Society for Personality and Social Psychology, Division 27, Society for Community Research and Action Psychology, Division 35, Society for the Psychology of Women, Division 44, Society for Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, and Division 45, Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race. It's been a joy to work collaboratively with this outstanding group of colleagues from across the field and the country. Each webinar was planned by representatives from at least 2 different divisions. Now we'll move swiftly to get to, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for taking the first steps toward policy-relevant research. Our first panelist is Dr. Helen A. NEVILLE, Professor of Educational Psychology and African Studies and Director of the Liberation Lab at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. NEVILLE is a past president of Division 45, president-elect of Division 17, the Society for Counseling Psychology, and has served on the executive board of BETSY, the Association of Black Psychologists. She has been honored with numerous awards, including most recently the APA Senior Career Award for distinguished contributions to psychology in the public interest. Welcome, Dr. NEVILLE. Next is Dr. BETSY LEVY PALUCK, Professor of Psychology and Public and International Affairs at Princeton University and Deputy Director of the Kahneman-Treisman Center for Behavioral Science and Public Policy. Dr. PALUCK is well known for their international large-scale fieldwork focused on prejudice and conflict resolution. She is a 2017 MacArthur Fellow, aka Genius Grant, and has been the recipient of the Princeton University Graduate Mentor Award and the Cialdini Award for Field Research. And finally, Dr. Asia A. Eaton, Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of the Power, Women, and Relationships Lab at Florida International University. She is also the head of research for Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, is an APA Fellow in Divisions 9 and 35, and has been honored with several national awards, including SPICY's Outstanding Teaching and Mentoring Award. I now introduce you to our moderator for today's webinar, Dr. John Paul Wilson, Associate Professor at Montclair State University and Director of Perceiving People Lab. He will lead us through questions and we will have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. Please actively use the Q&A as future webinars in this series. We'll aim to respond to the further questions that we may not get to today. We've also created free toolkits for viewers interested in learning more, and we will make sure to share those links also at the end, and you'll be able to follow up more. This will all be recorded and available on YouTube shortly as well. So I will now pass it to you.
Okay,
Welcome,
thank you.
John.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you to our panelists for being here today. As you all know, this is the second webinar in a 5-part series on fostering policy-relevant research. Last month, we had the kickoff webinar, which focused on the importance of getting involved in policy. So as the series progresses, we're moving toward talking about how to actually make that happen. So now that you've concluded that linking your research to policy is a worthwhile goal, how do you actually begin to do that? We'll be discussing that today, focusing not just on getting directly involved with policymakers, but also more generally bringing your research out into the world. So we've prepared a few questions to ask our panelists, and then we'll move on to asking questions that were either submitted by you when you registered or questions that are raised in the chat over the course of the next 30 to 45 minutes. So please, again, add any questions that you have to the Q&A box, and we will try to get to some of those as time allows. So our first question for the panelists today is, you all do research that can be brought to bear in policymaking and in communities. How did you decide that it was important to do this kind of work? For this question, I'll start with Professor PALUCK.
Great. Well, I'm really honored to be here. Thanks for having me. And I guess just to start off about why I'm doing this research, I'll say that I don't know that when I started, I knew it was important for me to do this research, but I knew I was really inspired to do it. And I was a big reader and sort of voracious observer of all of these different things going on in academia when I was a graduate student, and I was just really inspired by other examples that I saw, and going back really far. So thinking about Kurt Lewin and Donald Campbell and others who had been involved in directly in policy efforts. But then also, I mean, I remember taking the train down to see Heidi Hartman, a feminist economist who was working on policy in DC at the time, and just going to see her speak and trying to figure out, what that was all about. And so I think that it really works when you feel personally inspired by the work, and it was just really true for me. And fortunately, there are a lot of examples of academics, psychologists, and then psychology adjacent who are doing this.
Great, thanks so much. So now we'll go to Professor Neville.
Wow, thank you. What a thought-provoking question, but I also want to thank you for the invitation to be in this space and to share, be in community with you all. It's really an honor and quite humbling. But very similarly, when I was socialized into academia, it was at a very different time period than it is now. So I'm so glad to see that you all are offering such really rich discussions for folks to begin to think about policy. But for me, I think it came into activism. So I tried to stay and be in community when I was a graduate student, and trying to work with various different community organizations around racism, class exploitation. And I carried that with me when I went into the academy. So I've always been interested in working with, being in community with people and listening to what the concerns are and trying to figure out how is it that we can make a change so that our people are not suffering as much. And I think that's probably led me to more policy work. So it was really following my passion, looking at activism and seeing what the community is doing and following their lead, as opposed to me saying, I'm going to champion this research and then putting that into the community. And so early kind of socializations that I think in this way have been things like the Black Radical Congress, when that was there, it was an interdisciplinary group of scholars and activists working together to think through policy issues around pressing social concerns. And then more locally, there was a group called SisterNet and started to work with that 20-something years ago. And I still am fostering those relationships that inform the work that I do. So I think that would probably, yeah.
That's wonderful, thank you. Professor EATON?
Thanks for having me. Like Dr. Neville, I was not necessarily trained by my graduate education to build bridges between research and policy. I always knew it was important in an abstract sense, but I think it really hit home for me when I started working with community and activist groups like Cyber Civil Rights Initiative and Equality Florida and Lotus House. When I started working with these groups, they would let me know that they needed data for their advocacy and policy efforts. And they were very specific about the kind of data they needed. They said, we're coming up against these counter arguments when we try to get funding, when we try to change local policies. And it was up to me to sort of empirically investigate the accuracy of these counter arguments, right? And if theory and data can support the work they're trying to do. So for example, like Cyber Civil Rights Initiative had found that all these state laws on image-based sexual abuse or revenge porn had intent to harm clauses. And they were trying to get those removed because they thought it was too high a burden of proof. And they wanted me to help them investigate what percentage of perpetrators say they do this with the intention to harm. Because if it's not a lot, then we don't have a lot of victims protected. And Lotus House, it was a similar experience where they said, you know, there are people who think shelters aren't a good first step to addressing homelessness. They think you should have housing first. And then the question to me was, in what instances are shelters beneficial? What kinds of shelters are beneficial to help them with their local policy? So it was community organizations and activist efforts.
Great, thanks so much. So I think for the next question, it sounds like sometimes it can be pretty natural to sort of find yourself doing this work that you're really passionate about and really linking kind of naturally to policy. But I think there might be a lot of viewers out there who are kind of right now, especially earlier in their career, maybe doing more basic research, but really find themselves wanting to start doing work that can be applied by policymakers, by nonprofits, by community leaders. And so I think I'd just like to ask, what's one step that you might suggest that they can take in that direction? And for this question, I think I'll go right back to you, Dr. Eaton.
Sure. So I would say there's lots of types of policies you can affect. You know, don't think right away about amending the Constitution, right? Like, so there is the ERA, and if anyone's working on that, I'm available, right? But there's lots of policies, hyper-local policies that you can start to get involved in. Policies at local social service agencies or your own university. Right now, a PhD student and I are working to do some research on what public universities in Florida have as policies around birth control and contraception at their health clinics. And this is especially important in the state of Florida, where we are having these forced birth laws. They're trying to take it from abortion being only legal at 15 weeks to 6 weeks. So and student health centers are a major source of health support for university students. So you can start at a smaller level and think locally, think about what's going on in your neighborhood, in your community.
Great, absolutely. Dr. PALUCK?
Yeah, sure. I would absolutely echo what Dr. Eaton was just saying. I think also one point I'd like to make is that sometimes what we think of as basic research is extremely important for helping people working in the policy space. And so one way to think about taking a step toward addressing policy questions is to ask for what is needed and to really try to address some of these concerns with basic research. I'll just give you one really brief example. The great and late Diva Pager, may her memory be a blessing, did enormously impactful research that really addressed questions about banning the box and other kinds of employment discrimination by doing audit studies of discrimination with white and Black men applying to blue-collar jobs and testing whether their identification of themselves as having a record affected their callback rates. And I think in the social sciences, we would call what she was doing more like basic research, and yet she had a massive impact on policy discussions. And so, I think that we shouldn't always confuse the kind of work that psychologists do as, basic, as opposed to being in the field and working directly with policymakers as the only kind of research that counts. And so when aimed correctly, in part because you may have already had discussions with policymakers, you can tell, where the evidence is needed, what they would like from you, as Dr. Eaton was also saying, the kinds of evidence that they need. It might be that basic research is exactly it, right? But it also might be that you can start by, again, talking to groups locally, by emailing psychologists who are involved with policy work to say, how can I help? Can I get started in some way by helping you? But getting involved locally is a great option because you can talk to people one-on-one, and you can actually be there and be involved in those communities and discussions and see how to make yourself helpful.
Great. Yeah, those are really excellent points. Thank you. Dr. Neville?
Yeah, I just want to build on the really good comments that the panelists have talked about. And I love the idea of thinking globally, acting locally. And you just can't underestimate that. So thank you both for talking about that. While I agree, I might also offer just a slightly different interpretation. Now, while I don't do basic research, I do more applied research, but I think, find a topic that you are interested in or something that you want to make an impact on with your research, and then start to think about who is doing that work locally, and then start to kind of go to those places and sit quietly and be in community and learn from the people doing the work about what is important. And once you kind of have that sense of because that gives you a sense of why am I doing what I'm doing, and how could my research be of benefit? And so really sitting and listening and being in community, and then asking those questions after being part of that and building trust, and maybe even doing things that aren't even research related, but are related to the topic. Then from that informed way, think about, well, how could you potentially contribute with your basic research? And then through conversation with the group, begin to think through that. So again, I guess I just want to center the folks that are already doing the work, and the importance for us not to enter spaces as experts, but as co-learners with the communities in which we want to have the biggest impact on.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Neville. I think one thing that's really apparent in the work that all of you do is linkages with communities and with stakeholders in those communities. And actually that does kind of lead into the next question that I was planning to ask, which is, what do you do to ensure that policy relevant research is informed by communities that these policies may most impact? I'll also add that we got some viewer questions about working in lower or middle income countries, which I think might be relevant here for some of you. So again, though, thinking about making sure that this is informed by communities and working with communities. Dr. Neville, you already did kind of begin to answer this, but is there anything else that you'd like to add here?
Sure. I want to bridge then some of the things that were already said with how to kind of work with community. I really like this idea that Dr. PALUCK and Dr. Eaton was talking about, is like the notion that we could potentially, there's different levels of our policy. So who do you want to take action? What policies are we wanting to impact? And it could be as well as our department, our university, are the community in which we live in, statewide. So to really think about, there's multiple levels. So the community that you're going to work with depends on where you would really like to see your policy having an implication about. And to open your, and it also depends on the particular methodology that you decide to use. So some people use methodologies that are community-based research that really lends itself for the community to define what the particular issues are. So there are some interrelated projects that I've worked on that happen to be looking at gun violence and healing from gun violence in the local community. So we know that community gun violence is a major concern. And it is a major concern where I live in Champaign, Urbana. And there were two community-based projects that I worked on, one with youth and one with larger community, and they were both interdisciplinary projects. And we started with one project doing focus groups, work and having community members and paying community members to be part of the research project, and starting with focus groups to ask community folks, like, what do you think is going on? What are the top issues that you would like to work with? And through this process, gun violence began to emerge as a top issue. And then what we did through that was then began to have community forums, digital stories, because when we think about wanting to impact and inform policy, we think about what evidence do we have available to us to really move people. And when we think about evidence, there's all kinds of evidence that can be used to move policy forward, right? It can be the stories, such as through digital stories. It can be the quantitative data. It can be historical data. It could be a policy analysis. So it's really important that we don't work as individuals, but within teams, so that we can get all of our fingers crossed. And through then working with our community partners and our interdisciplinary team, then started meeting with taking things back to the community, paying them to say, hey, what kind of changes do you want? And then started talking to people within the community that can impact those changes. Met with our city council person, talk to the city council. So that's really a way, I think, of having, using and employing community-based participatory action research to inform particular policy. And maybe later on, I'll talk a little bit more about the other project, but I do want to save some space for others to contribute here too.
Thanks so much. I also wanted to mention for the panelists, if somebody says something that you want to kind of piggyback on, don't necessarily wait for me to kind of ask you a question. So please feel free to kind of jump in. But yeah, I'll go to Dr. EATON for the same question.
That was so beautifully answered. I don't have too much to add, except that it's a huge question, and we could have a whole webinar on how to do research that's informed by the communities, the policies and research will most impact. That's its own separate webinar. It's about your personal and professional identity, your values and morals, your ethics. And there's a lot of great readings on community partnered participatory approaches. And, I will again echo Dr. Neville and say that it takes a lot of time to build relationships with community members and organizations. It's not fast research. It's not research you're necessarily trained to do. I was trained in experimental methodologies, and when I started working with Lotus House, which is a very large shelter serving women and children experiencing homelessness, they told me point blank, we're not doing surveys. We're not giving surveys to our guests. If we're going to be gathering data, it's going to be through something like interviews and focus groups. And that's the methodology that makes sense for our guests. And, it took me several years of going to Lotus House, visiting, volunteering, before we put together an IRB. And the IRB had the CEO of Lotus House on it. She had to do the human subjects training and everything, but she was on it. And we had an MOU that was written by someone who has a legal background at Lotus House, describing, the community's ownership over the data and its right to review the products of the research. And folks at the organization helped to write the questions that we asked. They're on the paper as authors, right? There's so many ways that you can partner with communities and center their expertise and their needs.
Great, thanks so much for that insight. Dr. PALUCK?
Yes, these are, I can only just stand on top of these answers. They've really brought us very far already, and maybe offer a couple of resources that have been helpful to me here, and I can add them to the toolkit later as well. But I find a lot of inspiration, and I pass these on to my students in the participatory design and human-centered design literatures. There are a lot of really wonderful texts about design justice and feminist and participatory and liberation movements that, you know, have really written a lot about this, that are very helpful if you haven't been trained in this particular way. And everything that Dr. EATON and Dr. Neville are describing are exactly right. And I don't want people to feel like that means it's prohibitive to do as a student. I think these are slow projects. These are slow burn projects. These are the kinds of projects that you can be passionate about and devoted to and engage in, while having a few other projects on the side that, you know, you can show your department, see, I'm still doing things that you also recognize. These will take longer, you know, and really communicating with your supervisor, for example, about progress there, being really open and transparent about, you know, how the work is proceeding can help you to take that kind of a participatory collaborative process, because it does take a long time to set these up. And so I've actually worked in collaboration before on some projects. We just did, we completed a project on intimate partner violence in Uganda. And one of the many people working on that project, in addition to Ugandans and, you know, other public health folks and, you know, experts in intimate partner violence, one of the people was a human-centered designer, and she just had amazing methods for working with community in order to get their feedback. So, for example, prototyping exercises where ideas that are from the community and also from the research team are kind of made material. So she would actually create pictures representing these different ideas and put them on cards and give them to some of the pastors who were involved in the project and ask them, okay, can you sort these cards? It's almost like a cute old style Q-sort exercise in psychology. Can you sort these cards and tell us which cards, put them in a pile here if you recognize these as belonging to your faith practice? Do you recognize these ideas, and would you frame them in a biblical, you know, fashion? What ideas seem like not yours and you can't imagine bringing into your faith practice, and so forth? This was important because this was an intimate partner violence initiative that was in partnership with faith leaders in their couples counseling. And so that's just one example of a practice that she brought to us to help us bring together ideas from all of these disparate places and then bring them to community members so that they could tell us what they recognize, what they didn't, what they would like to incorporate, what they even maybe already do, and we can learn in that way too. So so I find a lot of inspiration from the design world actually as well.
Very cool. And I think it's also probably really helpful for especially students who are watching to hear this advice that you can pursue this work that may take longer to bear fruit, especially if you can find all, you know, other ways to kind of do some other work in parallel. And I think kind of, you know, maybe that question might kind of transition into a more general question about challenges. I mean, I think doing work in this realm obviously offers so many wonderful opportunities, but you've all been kind of hinting at the ways that this can also be challenging. And so I wonder if you could all speak a little bit more to this, whether it be thinking of a particular challenge you've faced or just in general, any advice that you might have as people do start to see some of the challenges in work like this. And I think I'll go back to Dr. PALUCK for this first.
Sure. And would you like me to talk about kind of starting out as a student, the challenges? Is that what you're interested in a lot, or?
I think that would be helpful. I mean, we have a variety of viewers. We have a lot of graduate students and postdocs who are watching, but we also have some folks who are who are in different roles and further along in their career. But yes, I think that could be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. Yes, let's see. So I think that there are so many different challenges. I wasn't necessarily following in anyone's particular footsteps when I was doing my research as a doctoral student. I was really inspired to do a project in the field. I was doing a review of the prejudice reduction literature, and I was looking for previous work that had been done in the real world to show that prejudice had been reduced in a non-lab setting. And so I was looking through the so-called gray literature, the policy literature, what interventions had been evaluated in a non-academic setting that I could use and incorporate in this review. And what I ended up finding were lots of programs that were described, but actually didn't have evaluations attached to that. And that's when I discovered that, you know, a lot of NGOs and other CBO, so non-governmental organizations and community-based organizations, when they get grants to do projects, often have to leave aside some money for monitoring and evaluation, or M&E. And sometimes they don't always have the capacity to do that themselves. And so when I was approaching some of these organizations that were doing those interventions, I would say, you know, I'd love to include an evaluation of your work in my review. And they would say, well, we would love to have an evaluation, but we haven't done it yet. And so, you know, I offered myself as free labor, and I was amazed and delighted to see that some of them actually had a little bit of money that we could apportion to actually do a study. And so I think, though, that the many challenges involved, making that activity seem legitimate to my psychology department. I think that it was recognized as almost like work that just really was so far out of the mainstream that maybe I was leaving the field while I was doing it, and I had no intention to leave the field. This is the work that I wanted to do. There was a huge learning curve. I didn't know what an MOU was, a memorandum of understanding was, but I would learn fast and how important that was. And so I had to talk to a lot of people to kind of cobble together an understanding of how to do this work. But I would echo Dr. Neville and say it really is a new era. There are books now about, working on, so I work on randomized controlled trials in the field. And, within that, you can do qualitative and participatory work, but there are actual books now on how to run those kinds of trials in partnership with NGOs and CBOs. But I would say that it's like learning a new workplace. You're not working on academy grounds anymore, and so you should not use the expectation. You should not bring with you and import those expectations, and you should learn from people in those worlds. So for me in particular, working a lot with non-governmental organizations, I had to learn what it's like to work at an NGO, and to take their perspective and understand their legal risks and community commitments and international commitments and so forth. And so that was just a big challenge for me. Was managing my audience, which was my department that was going to have a dissertation defense with me soon, and then entering this new world and learning their rules and norms. And I found it extremely exciting. I really liked doing that, and it's fun. But my advice would be that you should talk to people and ask a lot of questions and be an ethnographer of this new space before you bring with you expectations from the academy. Don't do that. Come and as Dr. Neville said, sit quietly, but also know when to ask questions, so that you can be useful and be useful in a way that they find useful.
Great, yes, and it's useful to continue to hear that theme coming back up. I think that's very important. Dr. Neville, do you have anything to add here about challenges?
Wow. I mean, I would say I don't have as much experience as Dr. Pollack. I feel like I'm still learning the process of the policy thing. So I think one of the biggest challenges is that we do not educate folks in psychology about how to even think policy. So we don't even have a conceptualization of what is possible with policy. So the biggest challenge is not having formal education around policy, and here's how research can inform policy. So a part of it is not even know what is possible. And I think there's probably a lot of missed opportunities that I've had from not thinking in a policy way and understanding what is possible. So I'll just give a quick example of that. For years, I've been doing research on racial ideology, colorblind racial ideology, not thinking about, well, what is possible with policy? And then come to find out, I see that people are using that at the local level to encourage to say that we need a measure of colorblind racial ideology as part of policing for police recruits in order to identify who's going to be part of the police recruits. Now, and they, as part of the city council, I wasn't involved with that. I know the people who were, because I didn't think that was possible. So we need folks to really help us dream and understand the work that we're contributing and how we can translate that into policy. I think that's the biggest challenge, and it has to do with my socialization and education to that point. So I feel like I've been having to play catch up for a while, even at my stage in the career. So there are a bunch of other one other challenge that I think is important. Many times we think that we have to have the right kind of data, and we have a very narrow notion of what data is. And so now at my big age, I'm like, oh, data and evidence can be broadly defined. So a challenge was a restriction of the notion of data. And one thing that I just also think is a challenge, and that I'm learning too, is how is it that we communicate our research and our findings in a way that makes meaning to policymakers and community that are relevant, and that we can, so I will elaborate that point on another response. But those are the three things that I think that I found challenges in my own personal life.
Great. That's a really great answer. Dr. EATON, do you have any
Sure.
thoughts here?
I'll be brief. I'll just say that I've shared those challenges, both not having a template or a guidebook, and no such thing exists, and not feeling lonely in doing the work, feeling like it's not legitimized in my academic space. And one of the ways that I started to cope with that was by aligning myself with existing efforts and divisions in APA that do legitimize this work, that do this work on a regular basis: SPICY, SCRA, FABS, organizations like this that value broader societal impact, and describing my work using words that have been given legitimacy by people like Dr. Jessica Henderson Daniels. She described the Citizen Psychology Initiative. That's an APA president. I'm doing what an APA president, values. So, we have concepts like public psychology. We have, community-based methods that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. And so sort of pointing to those sources as legitimizing my work, and engaging people in communities like SPICY.
Great, thank you. But one thing that's kind of been hinted at here, I think, like Dr. Neville just mentioned, kind of discovering that these discussions are happening out there in the world about, around like colorblind ideologies. And, I think that researchers often, we'll write papers and we might even make appeals to policy in the papers we write, but, possibly sometimes even as sort of almost an afterthought in a discussion section. Like, I would like to say something about how this could be applied, but I've not actually thought too hard about this. But I guess I would just like to ask about kind of how you, how you move from just kind of like, writing a paragraph about policy implications to actually kind of, doing something a little more serious with that. I think Dr. PALUCK also mentioned aiming correctly when you write about these things. And I wonder if there are insights that you all could share about that. Dr. Neville, I think I'll go back to you. And you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you. I think when you think about those statements, really being very clear about what specific action that you would like taken by whom. I mean, I think that we need to be that specific. And I might be out of pocket here, but I will share some things that I'm thinking about now. And this is really based on not only the research that I do, but last year I participated in the op-ed project, and I'm sure a lot of people have been op-ed fellows. And if not, if you have it at your university, I just think I would encourage you to apply to be an op-ed fellow, because it really allows you to translate your research to a broader audience and to write op-eds for that. And in doing that, I began to realize, and this gets to the public policy stuff, is that it doesn't have to be on this, it doesn't have to be just this specific finding right here. It is how your specific finding fits within a whole body of literature. So I believe that you should be making arguments that are based on your findings and the findings that are in the extant literature as well, in order to support a recommendation. So for example, if I were to do something now on, colorblind racial ideology, and perhaps making a connection to supporting the importance of having Black studies courses or ethnic studies courses, which I think is really important, and we need policy around that. I believe that I could say, okay, from this study, we know a couple of things. So we recently did a meta-analysis. So from the meta-analysis, we know that there's a link between greater denial, distortion, minimization of racism, and a whole host of anti-social justice beliefs, etc., and that greater racial conscious beliefs are related to greater social justice behavior. We also know that taking courses, this wasn't part of the meta-analysis, but we know in someplace else that taking courses can reduce colorblind racial ideology and can increase things like civic engagement, etc. So based on all of that, I believe that I would be able to make a recommendation to support the importance of providing ethnic studies and racial studies courses in the academy. So sometimes we have to do things that bridge things. The other thing in terms of these policy statements that I also thought was really interesting when I was working with the op-ed, that they really help you frame your particular argument of threes. Like you have to have 3 data points to support that. And those data points could be things in your data, but it also could be based on what other people have come up with and supported. So those are things that I would like to say. It's important work to be very specific about the recommendation, the action, who you want to take the action, for what reason, and what data in your article and other articles support that.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you. Dr. Eaton, do you have anything to add?
So the question is how to clearly communicate to policymakers and relevant stakeholders. I don't know that I have mastered that. I haven't mastered that skill. I'm still working on that, and I have lots of people edit what I write. I wrote an op-ed. It didn't get published, but folks at the Scholar Strategy Network helped edit that for me. to make it more digestible. I wrote an op-ed for Women's Media Center, and they had an editor there who helped edit it for me. I have people at the community organizations I work with read the white paper, read the policy brief. I just get a lot of help from others in writing for broader audiences.
Great, thank you. Dr. PALUCK?
Yeah, there are a lot of think tanks out there, and you can go to their websites and you can look at their policy briefs and see, how they write for a policy audience. And the way they write for a policy audience is a very different way than we write in our academic papers. And so, it doesn't mean that we should all be in the business of writing policy briefs necessarily, but I think it helps to educate you on the kinds of evidence that are required to actually try to move a policy audience. And you can see that, as Dr. Neville was pointing out, it's not just your one paper. And so I think it's a really smart suggestion to say, at least start by, in your discussion saying, this finding joins with these other investigations and so forth. But it's a good thing to have in mind. I think it also can help us to circle back to an earlier point of Dr. Neville's about, what is data? Because if you look to the policy sphere, one really important data point and policy talking point is stories. And so if you're actually doing work in the field in partnership with others, you have access to stories. And with the permissions of those communities, you can tell those stories. You can tell a broader narrative about people and how they live, not just, averages and variance and statistical significance findings. And that's something that's really needed in policy. That's sort of a political and policy necessity, is to be able to tell the story of why you're recommending this or that change. And that doesn't come from surveys all the time. And so once you get into that policy sphere, you start to realize, wow, that engagement is not just a value, it's a necessity as well, and it's a skill to learn.
Absolutely. We've got a few more questions here, but I wanted to ask Dr. Neville, you've mentioned a couple times wanting to share something that
I think I wove it in there. I think I wove whatever I had to weave in. I did it.
Okay, great. So another question that we've gotten from some folks, I think, as I've mentioned before, we have a lot of folks who are kind of earlier in their careers who are interested in developing careers around pursuing this policy relevant research. And, we often make decisions about what to pursue in our research programs based at least in part on our perceptions of what is fundable and what can kind of facilitate our careers. How can we have a career? And so I'm wondering if you all have any advice about how to kind of present this research, how to highlight this kind of work that in ways that can facilitate people's continuing ability to actually to be doing this. Dr. Eaton, I'll start with you.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, there are APA divisions and other organizations that do this work and that have dissertation fellowships and small grants that you can apply for. SPICY has a state and local policy work grant. FABS has the Doctoral Dissertation Research Excellence Award that prioritizes broader societal impact. So, apply to relevant grants in these areas to fund what you're doing, and then you have an award too on your CV. There's also relevant journals where you can publish this work, like SIPR, Policy Insights from Behavioral and Brain Sciences. There's so many. So you just have to look for the right outlets and the right organizations that can give you the money and the support to do your work.
Thanks very much, Dr. PALUCK.
Yeah, when we were talking before the webinar, you had mentioned this question, and I had sort of thought about it in another way too. I think one of the concerns that had been raised is, how do you stay in the academy? How do you get tenure and promotion, while doing this kind of work? So maybe I'll address that really briefly. I would say, just like any other work that you're doing, there's a lot of really cool work that's, working at intersections of various fields. So we're talking about intersections with policy, but there are other people who are out there, working at the intersection with sociology or, with computer science, and they may feel, oh, this is not going to be recognized as much. And I would give the same advice to everybody, which is that when it comes down to staying in the academy, you need to get letters when you go up for tenure. And so making sure that you've built a community of scholars, right? So you recognize other people in the field who are doing this kind of work, reach out to them and send them a draft and say, this is something I'm working on. Like, would you like to see, or, I would love your feedback if you have time, or I'd love to meet with you at a Zoom meetup or something like that. But it's important to build community because it keeps you from feeling isolated. As Dr. Eaton was saying, you can feel isolated if you're doing something kind of weird for your local environment. To me, doing something a little different and a little weird is just always a great sign that you're onto something interesting. But find that community of people, because those will be the people who also support you as you go through promotion, as you stay in the academy, and as you try to stay sane doing the work that you're doing, and actually find joy in it, and partnership in thinking through it. So find that through forming writing groups and reaching out to more senior people for feedback and so forth. And I think a lot of people who are working in these areas are really happy to hear about others who are interested in doing it and who are doing it. And so that's something that I would absolutely recommend. But I think it is a more generic recommendation. It's not like, for you specifically, you must do this if you work on policy. I think this is just a good way to try to build community in the academy among people who are doing similar work too.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. Thank you. Dr. Neville?
Yeah, just briefly to add everything that everyone said, ditto, and some additional things that I think grad students and early career professionals could do in addition to joining the organizations, BETSY, SCRA, etc., would be things like attend your city council meetings. That will really get to help you think about how are people thinking about policy and how is data being used. You will learn a lot. That could be your teacher. I think that taking a course outside of psychology that gets to this. Many times we're really insular. So if you're in grad students, you would be, there's lots of other courses that you could take in sociology, political science that can get you to think a little bit more structurally, which will be helpful. I would also like to challenge those folks that have power in this space is to work behind the scenes to change promotion and tenure policies that will allow this type of work to be counted. So I'd like to see how people do that. And I know that people read Dr. Eaton's and et al. They did a public psych, a whole special issue on public psychology and the American Psychologist that provides really good examples about this living, breathing in practice with some excellent recommendations. So I would encourage folks to do that as well.
Wonderful. And yes, thank you for plugging Dr. Eaton's special issue there. So we're getting pretty close to the end of our time here. And so I think in general, I'm just wondering if there's anything else that you all have to say in terms of whether it be recommendations for graduate students or any kind of takeaway as people kind of leave this webinar today, or words of inspiration. Could start with anybody who has anything that they're excited about sharing. I've left the most nebulous and difficult question for last.
I'll just go ahead and start. I think part of the reasons why people want to have policy implications is because they want to make a change in this world and they want to use their research as a part of doing that. So I just want to encourage people, you can use your skills as a researcher to make change in the society. You have the ability to do that. And sometimes you just have to jump in, feed in, and learn along the way. And there's lots of resources now that are available for you to do that. And I'm looking forward to seeing all the wonderful outcomes from folks taking up the challenge.
Thanks so much. Dr. Eaton, do you have anything you might add?
Sure. I'll just say that, if you're in this webinar, then you've got one foot over the start line, and it is a nebulous process. And I continue to feel like a novice, and the solution to that is to partner with people who have expertise and vision and history that you don't. Partner with people who've done this before, inside, outside the academy, with legal experts, with nonprofit service providers, council members, because your approach by nature is going to be narrow. And so continue to partner. If it feels nebulous, if you feel isolated, you're probably on the right track. Consider me as someone who will write your tenure letter if you're doing this work. And ultimately, APA really does value this work, because when you apply to be fellow, what they want to know is not how many papers you've published, and it's not how many grants you've gotten and how much money. They actually want to know how you have impacted the world with your work. Right? If you help to change a state law, that's a big deal for getting something like fellow. So, there are opportunities for you to be recognized, and there are people who value you doing this work, and we're sitting right here, and there's many more.
Yes, thank you so much. Dr. PALUCK?
Yeah, these are wonderful words of encouragement. I feel encouraged. There are days when I get discouraged, and I guess so thank you both for that. And I think that it is a really remarkable time in psychology. There are 110, there were 110 just a moment ago, people on this webinar. There's huge interest. We've broadened our recognition of the kinds of tools you can use as a psychologist, of the kind of partnerships you can make. And so I think it's just a really amazing time to be doing this kind of work. And so I agree, I think you should jump with 2 feet in. There's a lot of joy in this work. And also there's a lot of, you can take one thing with you, which is basic science ideas, which is that you have to build. Don't worry if you're not changing a state law right away. I've never changed a state law. It takes a really long time to make progress on these issues because the issues are important. So keep going, keep doing the work, and keep trying to build on what others have done and are continuing to do, and try to find the joy in that. I think that combining your science with everything that's going on in the world and with people who are trying to make a difference in the world can be really rejuvenating and exciting. So yeah, I would very much encourage it.
Thanks so much. I'm so inspired by this conversation. So really appreciate all of your conversation and answers here. So yeah, we're about out of time. Before we wrap up, I'm just going to hand it back over to Helen Hsu to talk a little bit about sort of the overall project here.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to our incredible panelists for not only sharing your professional wisdom and insights, but actively demonstrating what ethical humility looks like and the joy, even though the work is really hard. I hope this has really helped those interested in taking their first steps and entering this impactful work of policy impacting research. This has been a mentoring and collaboration masterclass. Thank you so much. Thank you to our team spearheaded by Dr. Abby Stewart, to APA, CODAPAR, and all the divisions that work to make this possible. And thanks to our audience who actually came from all around the world. It's very exciting to see. There are a lot of us out there who care about this. And it really instills hope in me too, to see so many spending time with us and thinking proactively about how to engage in this kind of work. The webinar recording and the toolkits will be available shortly on the SPICY website. So look at the links involved there. Usually hits YouTube within about a week. If you're coming to APA and want to talk about this, please join the session on August 4th at 11 o'clock. And that information has also been posted in the chat. And the next CODAPAR webinar series is How Do You Make Your Research Matter to Policymakers and Practitioners, being planned by Jackie White of Division 35, Richard Sprout from Division 44, date to be announced in the fall of 2023. So let's keep this dialogue talk going, and also think about going to the SPICY convention in late June in Colorado. So all that information on the website. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. Bye.